You finish in 90, Gulf War is the next year, right?
Yeah, and I got called over there on another project outside, and I ended up over there for over a month, right in the middle of the Gulf War
So, but as a civilian,
as a civilian. Yeah, I got called in by a very high ranking, I won't say who it was, but a very highest ranking agency guy. It said, "Would you come over and help us move Kuwaitis out of their, well, not Kuwaitis, but civilian Americans that were hiding in the homes in Kuwait, trying to get out of there, and they were blocked by Saddam, keep them out." So I had to find a way to get them out, and I had a way just set up. I literally had a Bedouin that was going to sneak them out and run across the desert and deposit them because he knew how the smuggling routes went. And the next day, I got the word that he'd let them loose. So a month and a quarter or so over there, and I didn't get to exercise my plan.
that
So
Saddam had let the Americans leave?
yeah, he said go ahead and go, and that was right at the time, so it worked out.
Huh. Now, I think when we're talking about something as recent as the Gulf War, there may still be some things that are classified, but so if you're not able to answer the questions, fine. But this operation, you had finished your time in the Navy as a SEAL. You're an O5 commander, Navy commander. The Gulf
Correct.
War happens the next year. You get called back as a civilian to help getting these Americans out of Kuwait. So did this involve then working with SEAL teams or maybe even Delta Force guys to get them out,
Yeah,
that kind of thing?
the answer would be no, although I did run into the guys that were from my colleagues. In fact, one of my classmates was over there, and I ran into him while I was in Bahrain. And so I did it. This was completely separate. It was run strictly by the civilians, and it was funded by the company that we were working for.
But if I'm assuming, I mean, there's a possibility of that there might be some a firefight or something if we're trying to get these folks out.
It's always a possibility, but they paid us well, and it was kind of my first introduction into, I don't know what you'd call it, but into going into contracts with foreign work and involving special ops plannings and things like that. So it
So
was right in line with what I'd been doing my whole career.
so kind of contractor special ops.
Yeah, I would call it that.
So
It was kind of like the pre-runner to the Blackwater folks.
that's what I was wondering. Yeah. Uh, CIA involvement, I'm guessing.
It was not, but it was guys that had come from there. So yeah, it
Oh,
was only involvement because of past experience, but not actually involved with them. This was
interesting.
strictly a civilian enterprise that was funded by the civilians, and while it was sanctioned for us to be over there and work, it wasn't involving any government agency at all.
But then after you said about a month after planning, Saddam let those civilians go.
Yeah, it was both gratifying and kind of discouraging because we'd set everything up and spent a lot of time planning, and had the money coming in to pay these Bedouins, and then it just collapsed. But that's okay. It's
Yeah.
an easy way to get out of there. No firefighting, no nothing was going to be risky, and they were literally put on a plane and sent away. So that was good.
But I think you just answered the question I had in mind, but a Navy SEAL for 20 years, or a little more than 20, um, you like to get stuff done. So I mean, was it a little bit disappointing that you didn't get to put the operation into effect?
You always like to think that when you plan something, it's going to work, and the only way to prove that it's going to work is to do it. And so, in that regard, yes, but I would say I had no disappointment in it. I mean, if you have a risky situation where you're trying to get out and somebody gets hurt and the operation goes awry, then I would feel much worse that way than I would have the way it turned out, obviously, by far.
Yeah. Now, when were you in the Gulf in the 80s? When you were deployed to the Gulf, really, I mean, most Americans aren't really thinking about the Gulf in a big way, really, until I think the Gulf War. There's an awareness of problems,
Yeah.
but it's the Gulf War of 91 that really brings that around. But when were you operating in the Gulf?
Well, there was two times. I mean, the first one was as a commander, and I was in charge of the barges that were out there as a task. It was a task element or a task unit that was in the northern Persian Gulf, and it was headquartered out of Bahrain. And so that was the first time, and that was right after I'd been removed from SEAL Team 3, put over there as a task unit commander, and then came back and finished my last year out. So that was the first time. Second time was as a civilian in 90 after I retired in June or January. And I was called to go over there in around August, if I remember right. Right when all the gas prices leaped into the atmosphere, and they needed the help, and that's when they called and said, come and do this as a civilian now.
You're in the Persian Gulf in the summer of '88. The year prior, the USS Stark was hit.
Correct.
And then in July '88, an Iranian airliner is shot down.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of tension in the Gulf at that time.
Yeah.
And you were there, so I wonder if you could just take a couple minutes. And then, if I understand correctly, you were on the radio when the airliner was
I was
shot.
actually on the radio when they announced that they were having an incoming aircraft coming in. They were signaling, stop, don't come. If you're going to come any further, we're going to get you. And then they shot, and then they went, oh, we're not so sure what that was. And that was that. There's a lot of things in there, and I won't try to get into their business. That was an investigation and all of that. The first time, though, there was tension was as I arrived over there, and I don't remember the exact date, but that was when we had we sunk the Iranajar. I think it was one of their ships, or maybe two of their ships. We also took down several of their oil platforms, and I arrived there the day before that happened. And so I was there when we were taking down those oil platforms, and that was my first day of duty on board the board.
And these are Iraqi oil platforms?
Iranian.
Iranian.
Right.
Iranian oil platforms.
It was told that we were not ever under combat, because if we were, we'd have to declare combat in a war, and we didn't want to do that. So we took action, military action, to compensate for what had happened to us with their mining project in the northern Persian Gulf. And one of those actions was to take down those oil platforms and a couple of their Navy vessels.
Are you allowed to say how those things were taken out?
There was a couple of ways. My understanding, anyway, was that some of it was taken out by bombardment by ships, and two of them were taken down by the SEALs landing on them and planting explosives and then evacuating and leaving.
Really?
And I don't remember the sequence of that, but those were the two ways that they were done. It was interesting because I landed on the barge. It was a kind of a funny thing. I landed on the barge, and I took over that day. My relief, the one I was relieving, had already left to go with the guys on board as a coordinator on one of the ships. And so I landed there and took over. And I remember walking up onto we had an upper deck that was kind of a place where the Marine Corps had their red-eye missiles in case anything came in on us. And I walked up there and climbed up the ladder, got on the surface, and we're all wearing just blue and golds and shorts and tennis shoes because it's so hot. And this kid looks up at me. He was probably an E5 or something. He says, "Excuse me, sir, you can't be up here." And I said, "Well, yeah, I can." And he said, "No, you can't." And I said, "Well, yeah, I can. I apologize. I haven't met you yet, but I'm the new commanding officer here." And he went, oh. And then, of course, you could imagine what a Marine is like. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right.
But it was a funny thing that happened that time. And of course, that led to other things that came later on, because the Iranians wanted to retaliate for the loss of their platforms. So we had what I would call attempted attacks against the barges, and by missiles and by high-speed boats and by F-14.
It sounds to me like we're talking about something like an undeclared war in the Persian Gulf.
Exactly what it was. And in fact, the chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, came out and visited us, and that was Admiral William Crow. And he came out and we said, well, we should be able to get combat action ribbons. And he said, no, because we weren't in combat. And we said, well, excuse me, sir. But he says, no, excuse me, you were not in combat. Am I making myself clear? And we said, yes, sir. You made yourself clear. We were on what we call classified barges. And they're not classified anymore, but they were former oil barges that were out there. One was 175 feet long. The other one was about 225 feet long. We had about 225 troops on each one. Some were expats that were help in the care and the feeding and the cleaning. Some were Marines, some were Navy, some were Air Force. And I think we might even had some Army guys on there for gunners. I literally lived on the Rembrandt 7, but the other platform was Hercules. And there were two of them. And because I was a senior guy on those, I was the senior and running both those barges.
So if I'm hearing you right, then these are basically US military outposts in the Gulf? Is that
Modified civilian platforms into be used for the military. I guess I put it that way. Yeah,
sure?
we'd had them rebuilt and restructured. We had helicopter decks and boat lift things and so forth to put on them. And we did that down in Bahrain in the shipyard there, and then towed them up into that area with tugboats.
So what kinds of things happen? I mean, we're in an undeclared war, but we're not going to say we're in an undeclared war, but things are happening that make the commander on the ground think that it's an undeclared war. So
Right.
what kinds of things are happening that lead you to think that we should be getting combat pay?
Well, there's several things happened. Number one, we were out there at the time when we had that combat action taking place on the oil platform and so forth. That didn't affect us in the way that I would call combat. But sometime later, we had, and by the way, along on a daily basis, we had helicopters and patrol boats patrolling the northern Persian Gulf and escorting U.S. flag tankers back and forth for safety for them. We had the helicopters up in the air only at night because they were at that time classified helicopters, and they were watching for any mine laying operations, which is against international law. And so they were on a constant lookout. They would fly at night and they would watch these boats and come in and out of Iran and making sure that they weren't, in fact, dropping mines. And then all along with that, we started having fear of things like the Scud missile program, where they were going to send missiles out against our barges because they're a big radar target. So the Navy, and its infinite wisdom, just developed what we called radar suckers, which are really just nothing but a lot of metal reflectors that sat on buoys and were anchored, and we put them all around the barge. I have at least 10 or more. And that way, when a radar missile was coming in on us, they wouldn't know which target we were. And the hope was that it would take one of the other ones out before it took us out.
And you did have missiles coming at these
And we
platforms?
did. And then we had a time when we had Scud missiles thrown at us. I actually saw one land in the water behind us. We had F-14s coming at us in a fleet, and they were painted by the radar of our guard ships that was out, the Navy ship guarding against us and watching for that. And then third, we had massive numbers of those small Iranian gunboats, run by the Iranian National Guard, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and they were coming at us, and they would turn around as soon as the ship would paint them and come at them, and we were ready to take them on too. None of them ever hit us, and that was a good thing. But there were a lot of times that we went to what I call general quarters, as you are aware of on a ship, because if something happened, I had to have everybody in a combat way. We had all the weapons manned. We had the patrol boats in the water to pick up anybody that might be blown into the water, and we had the helicopters ready to fly out and help do rescue missions too. So
Yeah.
it was I call it combat coming against us, and the admiral said no, was not combat.
But you have, what do you have, destroyers or frigates out there, just kind of?
We had it was both. It was they always had what I call a guard ship within about 15 miles of us, and they had the ability with their systems to detect incoming threats. For example, I remember one of the most I guess it would call nervous times that I had was when they said, we've got a Scud missile coming in at you. Missile, I didn't say what it was. We got a missile coming at you, and it's about 26 miles away. And then they started doing the countdown. So about every minute it would say 24, 23, 22. And of course, I remember we had two combat action or outposts, one on each flight deck. And one of the young kids said, he was just sitting there trembling. He said, "Sir, what do I do if I see this thing?" And I just looked down. I said, "Your job is to shoot the missile. And if you see it, you shoot the missile and take that down." He went, "Oh, okay." And he was absolutely calm after that. So there was a lot of little things that happened
Yeah.
that took place like that.
You know, when I look back on this period, and this didn't dawn on me until, I mean, 20 years after I had gotten out of the Navy, but I looked back on experiences I had in the Gulf and other places. Of course, we don't know that we're near the end of the Cold War at that point, but we look back now and know that the Cold War was almost over.
Yep.
And meantime, problems in the Middle East are ramping up.
Yes.
And I look back now and realize that although I was not aware of it, just even the little things I saw, I witnessed this kind of transition. We're transitioning away from the Soviet Union being a problem, because we would do things in relation to the Soviet Union, but that was almost like a game.
Yeah, I
The
agree.
Soviet Union thing was almost like a game. The
Yep.
serious stuff was coming from the Middle East, and it's right in
Well,
that period. Did you have the same perception?
I did, and I think I think it's not just perception. I think it was a reality. And of course, from that whole thing, when the plane got shot down, the Iranian air got shot down. You know, one of the things that happened out of that was the Iranians sent some operatives in over the Mexican border and blew up the commanding officer's car that had been in charge of that vessel that shot the Airbus down.
I think I might have a vague recollection of this, but you're saying Iranian operatives came across the Mexican border?
Into San Diego, went up to the house. They planted a explosive device underneath her car, and it was actually hoping to get either him or her. And when she was driving away, there was an explosion. I don't remember exactly what the damages were, but it could have easily killed her. It didn't apparently go high order or whatever caused it to not be deadly. And that was an act of war, of sabotage by a foreign nation against our nation on our soil.
In the late 80s, then, as your career is winding down, you do remember having a very strong sense that the Soviet Union really isn't the issue anymore, not the key problem. The key problem's coming from the Middle East now.
I'll even give you an example of something that happened. There was a large international force in the northern Persian Gulf because all these vessels were transiting oil and so forth back and forth. One of the forces that was out there were some Russian mine layers, mine ships, mine vessels, mine sweepers, I should say. And so we had a 1 nautical mile radius around us that was according to NOTAM, don't come closer to it. You come inside here, you're going to get prosecuted and probably shot. So I remember one morning they said, "Sir, get up here to the combat. We got a ship coming in on us." And here's a ship coming in about 20 knots directly at us. And I got on there, and then I could see it was getting really close. I put on my binoculars, and it was a Russian minesweeper. And they came right up that one nautical mile, turned sideways, and then waved at us, laughing, just playing with us.
Right. Yeah, it's like kind of a game,
Yeah.
right? We're going to keep this game going, and then, of course, then the Soviet Union collapses not long after.
Yeah, that was just a
Whereas
year.
with the Iranians, it's not a game.
Oh no, they were deadly serious. Absolutely. I always had a perspective that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard was one of the top operative units in the world. I mean, they've been touted as being very well trained, very good. But my perception of them after leaving there was they were like McHale's Navy. They really had they had no guts for one thing. They would turn and tail. Anything at all threatening, they would turn and run. But their tactics and stuff were rudimentary at that time. I'm not saying it is now.
Yeah.
And they were while they were supposedly to be feared, I felt after I left there they should not be feared. I felt we could easily bluff them out and keep them in their box if we had to.
The Iranians.
Yes. One of the things that I think came out of this, if I could, is that I believe it gave us a tactic we'd never tried before, and that is an advanced mobile platform that we could launch, and it was like having our own Navy vessel out there from which we had a lot of assets that we could utilize in a various number of ways. And it gave us a learning curve that we relearned again when we had the Gulf War later on. And I'll go so far as to say when we did the run on Kuwait, and that was the 5-day war or whatever it was. But when we did that, we re-realized that knowledge and put some more platforms out there and ran our patrol boats from them. We had helicopter platforms. We put special forces on them, and that became a tactic that became proven and effective.
Sure, and the special ops guys who are on these barges, they can be a quick reaction force and that kind of thing, right from the barge.
We were designed, for example, if they were to do a mining operation at night, and we saw them and caught them doing that, we had the ability to throw our platoon together, run out there with our little birds in our patrol boats, fly over with the UH-60s, drop onto the deck, and take them over and stop them. And we practiced that. And that was one of my very last operational things to do, was going through that practice of coming down on the deck and taking them out.